please welcome to the stage one of our absolute favorites, Jamy Ian Swiss. We love him so hard, and he's got his own kind of intro thing that we're going to do here today. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, and thanks very much for coming. Do I need that further away, Mark, to avoid that? All righty.
Actually, closer if you get feedback.
I'm getting feedback. In The Art of War, written roughly in the 5th century BC, Sun Tzu wrote, "All warfare is based on deception. Hence, when we are able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must appear to be inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. And when far away, we must make him believe we are near." Good afternoon. I'm Jamy Ian Swiss. I'm a professional magician, the author of 6 books. I've spent my life investigating and exploring deception in many forms, and I have lectured to law enforcement professionals about the workings of con games and con artists. I've consulted on casino gaming security and the workings of professional gambling hustlers and cheats. I've gone undercover with law enforcement to investigate phony psychics. Well, that's redundant. And talk to the dead mediums. And as a lifelong skeptic, I served as senior fellow of the James Randi Educational Foundation, where I helped to run the $1 Million Challenge, in which we offered for many years a prize of $1 million for anyone who could demonstrate a paranormal ability under mutually agreed upon test conditions. And no, nobody won. While spycraft and espionage are not my specialties, I became very interested in the intersections between magic and spycraft some years ago, thanks largely to my introduction and subsequent friendship with retired CIA Director of Disguise, John Mendez, who's sitting here somewhere, and about whom I will have more to say in the course of my talk. I eventually presented on this subject as part of a panel along with John at 2021 Comic-Con in San Diego, but I had learned much more than I could squeeze into that 10 minutes, and so today I'm presenting here for the first time this full-length version at DragonCon, so thanks for coming. Thank you. John McLaughlin, former Deputy Director of the CIA and for a period of time the actual acting director, has written that, quote, "Magic and espionage are really kindred arts." And I'm here to talk to you today about why that is, along with, as McLaughlin also wrote, quote, "the role of magic at key moments in history, putting the art of deception at the service of the state." In the introduction to the book Turnabout and Deception, Crafting the Double Cross and the Theory of Outs by deception expert and historian Barton Wiley, McLaughlin wrote the following, kind of a lengthy quote that sort of lays out what we're talking about here today. McLaughlin wrote, quote, "Every phase of the intelligence discipline involves some activity that finds an analog in the arts of magic and deception. Magic so often involves more psychology than digital dexterity, planting suggestions, creating mindsets that lead the audience to draw unwarranted conclusions about how something was accomplished. For the operations officer, that's the espionage officer, operator on the ground, for the operations officer, the challenge is different but also finds an echo in the magic field. An operations officer in a hostile environment, marked by heavy and continuous surveillance, faces the challenge of carrying out his or her work without being discovered, even while being constantly watched. So once again, this is akin to the challenge the magician faces on a brightly lit stage, seeking to entertain with deception an audience determined to detect his or her tricks. The magician must do things in front of an audience to accomplish his or her mission, if you will, without the audience noticing what he or she is actually doing. This is not all that different from an intelligence officer on a street under surveillance planning to pass a message or place a package while being watched. The case officer who can think like a magician starts off with an advantage. And so we begin with this man. This is Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin. This is a poster for one of his shows. A French magician who in the mid-19th century owned his own theater in Paris, Le Théâtre de Robert Houdin, and who has long been considered one of the most influential magicians of his time, if not of all time, thanks to his modernization of the style of stage magic, his use of modern technology, and his substantive approach to magic as a serious form of art. Robert Houdin was profoundly influential on a generation, or perhaps even two generations, of magicians who followed behind him, thanks to several significant and popular books that he wrote and that remain in print today, still to be studied by the world of contemporary magic. Now, if his name seems oddly familiar to you, it is likely because of one such young magician who, as a boy, found himself fascinated and inspired by the books and legend of Robert Houdin, and who grew up to become this man, Harry Houdini. Houdini was born Eric Weiss, and as a teenager he decided to adopt the name of his hero Houdin, adding an I at the end, and become forever and to this day the most famous magician of all time, Harry Houdini, who now died 98 years ago, and we're still talking about him. As an aside, while the public still thinks of Houdini as a magician, and while he loved magic and did include magic in his final fateful tour, he primarily gained and maintained fame and fortune as an escape artist, hence the lock and chain you see in that image. That was taken relatively late, pretty late in his life, and I think in his home. But Houdini also warrants mention today, and always when it comes to skepticism, because he was a vocal critic and debunker of phony psychic mediums in the era of spiritualism. And at one point, he offered a personal prize of $10,000 for any so-called psychic who could produce an apparent psychic effect that Houdini could not explain. And 50 years later, this would inspire James Randi, aka the Amazing Randy, professional magician and escape artist, to offer his own personal check, initially for $10,000, and that eventually led to the funding of the $1 Million Challenge. But the reason we're here thinking about Robert Houdin today is because of an extraordinary piece of history with which he is connected that has long been recorded and recounted as an event in which a magician was asked by his government to engage in a deception that would serve to put down a revolutionary military uprising in Algeria. There may be no more dramatic example of the intersection of magic and military in the history of magic. Now, as the story goes, in 1856, Robert Houdin was requested by Napoleon III's government to travel to Algeria and use his magic to help suppress a potential violent uprising by demonstrating that the power of French magic was overwhelmingly superior to that of the mystics among the nomadic wise men of North Africa known as the Marabout. The Marabout were and are Muslim holy men, often wandering, considered religious teachers, often scholars of the Quran, often admired for their transparency and righteousness. They were known to renounce political powers, but while ensuring economic, social, religious stability within their religious communities, but they also had political influence nonetheless because of the respect they were held in. They could read and write, and village chiefs would frequently appoint Marabout as secretaries or advisors, means to communicate with other neighboring rulers. So, through the period of the French conquest of Algeria from about 1830 to 1903, there were periodic revolts and uprisings, sometimes supported by various factions of the Algerian Marabout. Now, as has often been recounted in magic history books, Robert Houdin arranges an open-air performance for a large gathering of the Marabout leaders and the mystics, during which he demonstrates the overwhelming powers of the French. He produces endless amounts of money, coins, demonstrating riches. He produces multiple cannonballs from a hat, demonstrating armaments. He has a Marabout fire a gun at his head, whereupon he catches a marked bullet in his teeth, a trick you may have seen performed by Penn and Teller. And then in his greatest and most terrifying feat, he invites the strongest Marabout warrior up to assist him. And present on the stage is a small wooden box. The warrior is invited to lift the box by its handle, which he easily does, and then Robert Houdin announces that he will magically rob the warrior now of his fantastic strength, rendering him a weakling. and then directing the marabou to lift the box again, he is now utterly unable to do so. Straining and pulling with all his might, he cannot lift the small box. He jumps away from it finally in horror. Terrified, he runs away, and thus Robert Houdin established the inescapable and absolute power of the French government, military, and magic. Man, that's a great story. It'd be even better if it was true. It is an early historical example of a magician using deception while working to advance the power of the states. That much is true. In the 2018 book, The Secret History of Magic, co-author, noted illusion designer and magic historian Jim Steinmeier who has told that story in previous books of his own, actually, in his book Hiding the Elephant, but in this book, he took a very deep dive into the verifiable facts of what really happened. And it goes something like this. So Robert Houdin was retired. He only owned a theater in Paris for about 15 years, and he was very successful, but he was an intellectual, and he retired because to go back to pursuing inventing optical devices, some of which are still in use in medicine today. So I believe he was retired by now. But he was extended an invitation, actually for several years running, on behalf of the government to come to Algeria and perform kind of as a gesture of the state. There was no imminent uprising in 1856, the year that Robert Houdin elects to go. He books a series of performances at a grand theater there, a beautiful theater, which presents him with some handsome income from ticket sales. The Marabou are disinclined to attend these kinds of events, but eventually a performance is arranged. Robert Houdin had in his career uplifted the art of magic by casting off even the theatrical pretense of ancient mysticism. So his was a rational mind. Like myself, he saw magic as a rational or even a skeptical art. He wasn't didactic in his skepticism, but he believed that magic should not be presented as in the guise of supernatural power. So in his performance, he really quickly abandoned the uncomfortable posture of supposedly demonstrating that he was doing something real. He mostly slipped primarily into his more comfortable role of sophistication and good humor, and the Marabou were quite able to grasp this posture. They understood. And so while he did perform all of the feats that I mentioned, the Marabou were suitably impressed and respectful and appreciative, but they didn't really mistake it for the supernatural. In the end, Robert Houdin was thanked, formally and officially, by both the Marabou and his own nation's government. And Steinmeier writes that, quote, the actual story is much more interesting than the mythological one, because the actual story, again, quote, is a story about the presentation of magic. Okay, so this is really a kind of an artistic issue. Robert Houdin had performed a version of the light and heavy chest in his shows in Paris, and that title communicates the way he performed it. In other words, he presented a small box that was light enough to be easily lifted by a volunteer. Then he'd cast a magical spell on the box, which would then become dense and heavy to the point of being immovable. The magical effect was about the box. And it was mystifying because it was an original idea of Robert Houdin's, who I mentioned was ever one to put to use the latest technology in order to help amaze and mystify his audiences. He was one of the first to use electric lights in his theater. And so the method of the light and heavy chest was indeed cutting edge because it worked by way of a powerful electromagnet. See? Clever, huh? But as Steinmeier says, like I say, the story is even better because Robert Houdin changed what magicians call the presentation for the trick. Instead of the trick being about the box, when he went to Algeria, he made it about his ability to wield a weird and astonishing power, the ability to rob a strong man of his own physical strength. That's brilliant. And that's the kind of story that gets told and retold and told again. And here I am telling you about it 170 years later. And it's a damn good story, isn't it? Yeah. By the way, this is me with the actual light and heavy chest. Photo taken just a couple of years, 2 years ago or so, 3 years ago. I had handled it in the early 2000s. It was in the collection of a wonderful guy named Ken Klosterman. who had one of the largest collections of magic memorabilia in the country. And the box is sort of a, holy grail amongst magic memorabilia objects. And it was restored. He had it restored. And then just a couple of years ago, when Ken passed away, he was in Cincinnati, and he had this whole lower section of his home that was built into this incredible museum. And so I was there the weekend that famous magic auction house, Potter and Potter, were basically cataloging the collection for auction. And not long after this photo was taken, the light and heavy chest sold for $156,000. And now, we jump forward to the era of World War II. This is Brigadier General Dudley Clark, considered the godfather of deception in modern warfare. He was an amateur magician. He was the grandson of Sidney Clark, who edited the Magic Circular, the British Magic Journal, 1909 to 1914. Sidney Clark, the grandfather, was the author of the Annals of Conjuring, the first real history of magic in the English language, still a useful book today. First appeared in serialized form in The Magic Wand from 1924 to 1928. So Sidney Clark's amateur magician grandson, General Dudley Clark, would eventually be made head of A-Force. That was the British military deception unit of World War II. And among other things, he managed to create legions of fictional Allied military units, forcing Hitler to stretch his forces and deploy them where no threat existed. This is a true story. Clark had a hand in the British fielding a deception operation that was really just an example of misdirection on a continental stage, namely Operation Bodyguard, a deception campaign for preparing for the 1944 invasion of Normandy. By the spring of '43, the Americans and the British had prevailed over Hitler's forces in North Africa, but in that year leading up to it, before D-Day, the Allies had to push northward through heavily fortified Nazi defenses up into southern Europe, and the logical route would have been the then German-occupied Italian island of Sicily. But a series of deception operations were used to throw Hitler off the scent and make him think that the Allies were not going that way. And the British centerpiece of this was Operation Mincemeat, a truly bizarre covert action in which the British set a corpse afloat off the coast of Spain, dressed as a British officer, loaded down with phony and misleading documents that they hoped German spies in Spain would read when the body washed ashore. This is true, and this worked. The body was set afloat from a submarine off the coast of Spain in 1943, dressed as an army major, carrying phony documents which described an Allied attack from North Africa that would aim for Sardinia or Greece, not Sicily. And the body washes up on shore, and Spain collects and passes the documents along to the Germans. And remarkably, the Germans bought the scam, which the British reinforced by circulating false rumors in diplomatic circles and about diversionary military maneuvers. And as is often the case with successful deception operations, they planted the doubly false idea that widespread media talk of invading Sicily was nothing more than a trick to throw the Germans off. So in other words, they used a deception within a deception to make the deception more convincing. Okay? And that worked. So the result is that Hitler thins out his forces in Sicily and diverts forces to Greece, and the Allies faced reduced resistance in taking Sicily on the way to the mainland. Truly misdirection on a very large stage. Now, Clark was a military man and not a trained intelligence operative, but he made several sojourns in London and Lisbon where he masqueraded as a journalist, spreading rumors and false information to the Germans. And pleased with his success on one of these trips in London, he made a return trip of similar sort of semi-undercover nature to Lisbon, posing as a journalist for the Times. But later that month in Madrid, he was arrested while dressed as a woman. This infamous photo was taken by the Spanish police while he was in custody. His explanation for this situation was unconvincing. But among other reasons, that his hotel luggage was filled with a variety of women's clothing. But with the help of various individuals in terms of events, it's a complicated story, he managed to eventually be safely transported out of Spain by way of Gibraltar, where he was finally ordered back to London to explain the Madrid incident. Now, these photos that were taken by the police was circulated in London among the high command and supposedly reached Churchill's desk. But they were viewed mostly with amusement. He was allowed to return to Cairo, his special area, and reached Egypt within a month or so of all of this, where he returned to his leadership role in military deception. And although he escaped disciplinary action over the incident, it was the last time Clark attempted his own espionage work. And I think it's great that in the end, he was probably a cross-dresser, and it did not stop his career, and it just was put to the side and chuckled over cocktails, and he moved on and back to his work. So, wear your freak flag, buddy. I'm for it. This is Jasper Maskelyne, the third generation of a legendary British magical dynasty established at the turn of the 19th century by his grandfather John Neville Maskelyne, who for many years in London would operate a series of Europe's leading theaters for the performance of magic. The original was called the Egyptian Hall. Maskelyne was a thoughtful, artistic innovator and performer and a writer. He co-wrote a book of magic theory called Our Magic that was completely groundbreaking at the time and is still studied today by contemporary magicians. I'm a big fan of that book. Maskelyne's son Neville, the second generation, carried on the family tradition with significant success, and then his son Jasper, in turn, also became a professional magician, stage magician in his 30s and 40s, until he entered the British military, rising to the rank of captain. And when amateur magician and chief military deceptionist Brigadier General Dudley Clark crossed paths with Jasper Maskelyne, a family name he would have already been well familiar with, it was Dudley Clark who hired Army Captain Jasper Maskelyne to head a camouflage unit working against the Germans in North Africa. Now, the Jasper Maskelyne legend was memorialized in this book, The War Magician by David Fisher, whose extravagant claims make it sound something like Maskelyne single-handedly defeated the Germans in North Africa. And many of Fisher's claims were debunked eventually by a researcher named Richard Stokes, a Brit, who I heard speak on the subject some years ago at a conference. And as the saying goes, though, soon to be a major motion picture. This is a story from Deadline Hollywood. Quote, fresh from wrapping Jurassic World Dominion, Colin Trevorrow is set to direct War Magician, a Studio Canal World War II drama that will star Benedict Cumberbatch. E. Nicholas Mariani is writing the script based on the book by David Fisher. Now, that's a little stale. There have been various versions of that story over some years now, at least 4 or 5 years, although that story is more recent than that, maybe a year or two. Cumberbatch has been attached to the project since pretty early on, but, it's the movie business, so will it ever get made? I'm not sure, but... So, anyway, it is true that eventually Jasper Maskelyne was transferred out of the deception unit and would serve out his military tenure as a performer doing shows for the military. So, but even Stokes gives Maskelyne credit for successfully camouflaging British tanks in North Africa with a device called the sunscreen that made them appear from the air as trucks. Okay, so you can see this here, right? So it's tank disguised with the fold-up apparatus as trucks, and includes an apparatus. It's not really clear, but the lower left photo, there's this sort of rig on the back there, and this is Maskelyne's also idea that it was a device to erase the tank tracks in the sand, right? Because that's identifiable from the air. And in addition to the sun shields, he also created tools for escape and evasion, including buttons that concealed compasses, silk maps, edible paper, hacksaws hidden in zippers, and maps made of flash paper, which is something magicians use, a paper that burns instantly and leaves no residue. So he really did some real stuff. And in some cases, the need was to disguise That was real armaments being disguised as innocent equipment, but in other circumstances, the goal was to create the illusion of the presence of dangerous military armaments that didn't really exist, like these fairly convincing-looking tanks, which are not designed to be convincing up close at all, but rather from the air, and they are, in fact, inflatable. That's awesome, right? And this stuff, we're going to come back to this. This set a precedent. This was the beginning of, you'll see, this is not an extinct kind of technology for the military. All right, let's move on, though, now to a guy named John Mulholland. John Mulholland was dubbed the Dean of American Magicians in his day, and the only magician of his era listed in Who's Who in America. He performed in 42 countries. He wrote 10 books on magic, performed at the White House 8 times. He received on his death a full-length obituary in the New York Times in 1970, which included mention of his having taught classes at Columbia University and so on. In Mulholland's 1944 book, again one of 10, this was called The Art of Illusion, Magic for Men to Do. It was selected by the Council on Books in Wartime to be reprinted as an armed service edition, a small paperback distributed to U.S. military personnel. It's estimated that almost 100,000 copies of the Armed Services edition were printed in November of 1944, making it probably the most popular magic book of World War II, at least by quantity produced. Now, Mulholland amassed a substantial, it's a bit of a side story, but interesting. Mulholland amassed a substantial library of conjuring literature consisting, I believe, of some 4,000 volumes, which also included part of his friend Houdini's private library. Houdini was a big collector. And as of 1966, the collection resided for several years in the Players Club in New York City, of which Mulholland was a member. This is a famous private club for actors founded in 1888 by Edwin Booth, the country's leading Shakespearean actor at the time, and also brother of John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of President Lincoln. The Players Club, which is still there in Gramercy Park today, and I've actually performed, I've been a member. The Players Club purchased the library from Mulholland for half its worth several years later, where it remained for decades, until in 1984 the club decided, against the wishes of Mulholland's widow, to sell it to a wealthy banker named Carl Rubin. In 1990, Rubin's savings and loan firm failed in the era of the savings and loan scandals, and the library was designated by the court to be sold at auction. And in the 11th hour, magician David Copperfield was encouraged by a friend and advisor to purchase the collection and keep it intact. And while David acknowledges today that at the time he had little personal interest in the history of magic, I can attest firsthand these days that he has developed a great passion for the subject and for his extraordinary museum, now probably the largest collection of magic, memorabilia, literature, all kinds of things in the world. It's probably at least 5 times the size of the original Mulholland collection, maybe more, and it's housed in this building in Las Vegas, Copperfield's International Museum and Library of the Conjuring Arts. There's a lovely book entitled David Copperfield's History of Magic, published 2021, that offers kind of a guided tour, beautiful photography, select elements of David's collection. And the museum is not open to the public, but it's available to researchers and guests, and I've had the pleasure of David touring me through it on a number of occasions. It's quite remarkable. Now, but back to Mulholland and why he's important to our subject today. Very important. When John Mulholland died at the age of 1971, the obituary that ran in the Times on February 26, 1970 left out one key piece of information that was completely unknown at the time. It would be another 30 years before it would be made public, thanks to a Freedom of Information Act release, that Mulholland had secretly worked for the CIA. When the story broke for the magic community, a little after it became public knowledge, when the story broke for the magic community in this April 2001 issue of Jamy magazine, cover story called The Sphinx and the Spy, it's fair to say it sent shockwaves throughout the world of magic. It turns out that Mulholland had been an integral part of the CIA's secret, but eventually notorious, Operation MK Ultra. Perhaps you've heard of it. Now, in the rise of the Cold War, the American intelligence community feared that the Russians were developing secret weapons of mind control and a newly created term at the time, brainwashing. And the U.S. feared a mind control gap. And so in 1953, Allen Dulles, CIA director at the time, approved creation of Operation MK-Ultra, devoted to research and development of clandestine chemical and biological warfare. MK indicated was a division of TSS, the Technical Services Staff, responsible for special weapons, forgeries, disguise, surveillance, and kindred tools in the espionage trade. And assigned to heading up the chemical division was a man named Richard Gottlieb, a biochemist. The same day that Dulles approved MK-Ultra, Gottlieb went to see the magician John Mulholland. In the words of a journalist and researcher, Michael Edwards, quote, Gottlieb knew how to mix the potions. The question was how to deliver them secretly. Mulholland agreed to help, close quote. Gottlieb proposed that Mulholland create an operations manual about how to apply the skills of the conjurer, sleight of hand, misdirection, to clandestine missions. To free his schedule for this probably better paid endeavor, Mulholland suddenly stepped down from his long-standing post as editor of the most important conjuring journal of the first part of the 20th century, the Sphinx, hence the Sphinx and the Spy, attributing the withdrawal to health reasons. It was somewhat surprising that Mulholland had stepped down. With several expansions of the original proposal, over time, Mulholland would eventually receive a total of $4,800 to write the manual and also be kept on a regular paid retainer for several years to follow. If you multiply that roughly by a factor of 10, it'll give you today's dollars. Significant, not huge, but it's a living. At one point, Mulholland consulted with his agency employers as to how to list his income for his federal taxes without revealing the nature of his work, and eventually he was instructed to declare the income under the nature of his more usual work as a performer and an artist, and then the agency reimbursed him for the additional taxes he therefore incurred. I love that. Now, after several extensions and expansions, Mulholland completed the manual in late 1954. In 8 chapters, Mulholland described methods for secretly administering substances in forms, including liquid, gaseous, powder, and pill form, means of surreptitiously obtaining small objects, strategies and tactics adapted specifically to female agents, and techniques of secret-coded communication between members of a team. Yet in all of this, words like agent or mission were never used. In case the manual fell into the wrong hands, like the public or civilian government reviewers, the tasks were referred to as tricks. The operators referred to as performers. And as such, it doesn't read quite as oddly as it sounds, because in many instances, Mulholland was readapting work for his books written for magicians and the public, and in some cases the other way around. So I'm going to read you a somewhat lengthy excerpt here. And this is from the manual now. This is not from a magic book. This is from the CIA manual. I'm sorry. I misspoke. This is from his book of 1963, his later magic book of 1963. Let me read that first. So this is written for the public. So it's a magic book, but imagine if it was written for Spycraft, okay? Quote, a magician should know all the details of every trick he publicly performs as well as he knows his name or where he lives. He should not have to stop to consider or worry to remember. This does not mean endless repetition in practice, but rather a careful, studied analysis when he is learning what to do. When the reason is understood for doing what is required, it becomes easy to do after a few repetitions. All other details in action are what one would do normally, but as each action, normal and unusual, is necessary for the success of the trick, all have to be memorized and in order. If you do know each step so that the trick will run off smoothly, you need have no worry about a confident manner. The confident manner, the easy, natural actions, and particularly what the magician says as he performs, all tend to help the spectators ignore many things that they actually might see or about which they might feel suspicious, but they don't because of the natural delivery. Okay, this is from a magic book in 63. Now, from the CIA manual in 54. Though practice is essential to successful deception, much less practice is needed than might be imagined, providing a person knows exactly what he is to do, how he is to do it, and why it is to be done in that way. The success of the act becomes more of a matter of memorization of details than of physical repetition. Close quote. So he wrote the manual and then basically took his own work, turned it into a magic book. In 1955, Mulholland's continued services were expanded to include providing ideas and instruction on how to secretly communicate information between agents in the field, again drawing on methods of magic. Then in December of 1953, Mulholland's work was further expanded to include research and investigation into mind reading and psychic claims, because this was the beginning of the era when they were when the government and intelligence agencies were concerned about a potential psi gap, PSY, psi gap with the Ruskies. So Mulholland was a perfect choice for this, as he was a rationalist and a skeptic, and knowledgeable of methods of mentalism and psychics. He'd been lecturing and debunking psychic claims since the 1930s. He wrote his own book on the subject called, that was debunking spiritualism in 1938, called Beware Familiar Spirits. Mulholland had also helped his friend Harry Houdini prepare his own lectures exposing the methods of fraudulent spirit mediums. He was a perfect guy to go to. This is almost a repeat of, or excuse me, my own. I have some experience of my own. It's almost a repeat of this kind of situation. The agency had come across a man who claimed he could read minds and whose demonstrations of these special abilities had confounded some CIA people. Mulholland was asked to investigate. Upon doing so, quickly explained to the agency that the man was a magician using techniques well known in the field of mentalism, which is a part of magic that creates illusions of mind reading and mental phenomena. John Mulholland continued to submit vouchers and to be paid into 1958. Quite a story. And the manuals eventually reprinted. This is a reprint from about a dozen years ago, and you can get this over the counter. Severely redacted, however. I'll come back to that. This is Frank Olson. While MK continued conducting as many as 149 projects involving drug testing, behavior modification, and secret administration of mind-altering chemicals at 80 U.S. and Canadian universities, hospitals, research foundations, and prisons. All right, so this is post-Mulholland, but this is MK in its prime. Hundreds of individuals served as guinea pigs for these experiments, many willingly and some not so much. One of those who was not so much was Dr. Frank Olson, bacteriologist and biological warfare scientist, who was secretly given a dose of LSD under Gottlieb's direction on November 18th, 1953. 10 days later, on November 28th, Frank Olson either jumped or was thrown out the window of the Statler Hilton Hotel in New York City and fell 13 stories to his death. His roommate was Gottlieb's assistant, Robert Lashbrook, who had secretly administered the LSD dose to Olson at Gottlieb's instruction. In the interim between the dosage and the death, Gottlieb and Lashbrook took Olson, who was by then depressed, possibly delusional, perhaps behaving erratically, at least according to CIA accounts, which are debatable. But they went to meet for a time. They took Olson, Gottlieb took Olson, to meet with John Mulholland on November 25th. Mulholland is in no way implicated in Olson's death, but the purpose of the meeting remains debatable to this day. We're not sure. Possibly Gottlieb was hoping that Mulholland might be able to hypnotize Olson for some therapeutic purpose, truth-telling purpose. We're not sure. While Olson's death was ruled a suicide, the case came to public attention much later in 1975 with the release of a report from an investigative commission chaired by then Vice President Nelson Rockefeller about MK which, among other things, revealed the CIA's experiments with LSD and caused a huge outcry. The Olson family recognized that one of the examples cited, without too many specifics, but one of the examples cited was in fact Frank Olson, unnamed in the report, but the situation and the death and the LSD dosing and then the death was right there. Thus began a lengthy battle between the Olsen family, led by one of his sons, Eric, who's still alive, and the government. Eventually, the family would be paid $750,000 in compensation, and in 1975 received a formal apology, as you can see here, from President Gerald R. Ford, delivered face-to-face in the Oval Office. There's also a document on record. They also signed an agreement that they could not further sue about the case, about the death. However, much about the case remains in dispute to this day, having been re-examined by investigators, attorneys, journalists, and in a documentary series you can see on Netflix by the filmmaker Earl Morris entitled Wormwood. Now, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all the records destroyed, the MK Ultra records destroyed in 73, 10 years after the project had ended. Mulholland died in 70, taking his secrets to the grave. His work for the agency first became known when some items were declassified in 1977, but much of what we now know about Mulholland's work with MK Ultra didn't come to light until the Freedom of Information Act request eventually led to the release of more than 200 pages of documents in the year 2000. But when the manuals were eventually made public, out of 121 original pages, 56 were made available, with a third of the material redacted and remaining secret today. The two Mulholland manuals are among the few substantive records of MK Ultra to have survived. I am the furthest thing in the world from a conspiracy theorist. And that's because being a skeptic, skeptics rely on evidence, the nature of evidence, and on parsimony, right? As you start with the simplest explanation, conspiracy theorists are the opposite. They rely on complex explanations or invented without evidence to fill gaps. I am not a conspiracy theorist. I don't consider myself an expert on this case, but there's a lot of stuff out there. There's a really terrific website that the Sun maintains, called the Frank Olson Project, and I'm going to say 60-40, they threw him out the window. The evidence that he was suicidal is dim. All righty. So MK Ultra begins in 53 and was shut down in 64. This lovely couple is Tony and Jana Mendez. Tony Mendez had a 25-year career in the CIA from 1965 to 1990, thereabouts. His wife, Jana, worked in the CIA from 1966 to 1993, pardon me. The two met while working in the agency and married in 1991. Tony Mendez was a talented artist recruited out of art school to become a documents forger and expert, and who would eventually become responsible for a number of exfiltrations, that is, secretly safely extracting endangered agents and double agents from dangerous to safe territory. Let's call it that. Mendez was directly involved in the exfiltration of 6 American diplomats, famously from Iran, in January 1980 in the aftermath of the Iranian Student Revolution, and as dramatized in the film Argo, starring and directed by Ben Affleck. What became known in intelligence circles as the Canadian Caper was the joint covert rescue by the Canadian government and the CIA of 6 American diplomats who had evaded capture during the seizure of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, November of 1979, when Islamic students took most of the American embassy personnel hostage, demanding the return of U.S.-backed Shah for trial. I'm going to talk a bit about the movie, but I'm not going to delve into the details of the operation as it worked, because you're going to learn more from that from Jana's presentation tomorrow at 1 o'clock, and also from a panel that we're doing, I think, Sunday about the film. So I'm not going to go into the details of the operation right now, but I will tell you some fun stuff. So here, there's Tony Mendez in the middle as he appeared during the days of the actual operation occurred. There's Mendez, Tony on the left in formal gear. I suspect this photo was when he was at the Golden Globes, where they got a bunch of awards, and that's Ben Affleck in the role of Tony Mendez. With the eventual declassification of the story, and at the urging of George Tenet, director of the CIA from 1997 to 2004, Tony Mendez was convinced eventually to tell the story in his book entitled Argo, and then the book was adapted into the film. And Affleck later said that in the course of making the film. They were granted unprecedented access at CIA headquarters in Langley, thanks to Mendes's agency reputation and efforts. When his reputation was substantial. At the 85th Academy Awards, the film was released in 2013. The film received 7 Oscar nominations, including Best Picture, Best Supporting Actor for Alan Arkin, went on to win 3 awards, Best Picture, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Film Editing. It was an unusual thing. There's only 5 cases where film got Best Picture and the director was not nominated. Argo earned 5 nominations for the 70th Golden Globe Awards that year, winning for Best Motion Picture Drama and Best Director for Affleck. If you haven't seen it, it's a terrific film. It really holds up well, and you will learn more about it in the coming days. In January 1980, Mendes was awarded the Intelligence Star for Valor for engineering and conducting the rescue of 6 U.S. diplomats from Iran. This is one of the rarest and highest intelligence community awards, and because it's the intelligence community, it was a secret, which is alluded to in the closing credits of the film. It did not become public until the records were declassified decades later. He was presented to it. It was presented by President Carter. So, now, Tony's widow, my friend Jana Mendes, who is here, also had a stellar, lengthy career as an undercover operative in the CIA, eventually retiring as Director of Disguise. She operated for a substantial period of time in Moscow during the height of the Cold War, guiding breakthrough developments in disguise and deception. And she'll be detailing some of that in her talk tomorrow, and trust me, you want to see that. She has fantastic stories to tell, fantastic visuals to go with it. So I won't step on that today. And she'll also be talking about her new book, In True Face. Between Jana and Tony, Tony wrote a couple of books on his own. They wrote some books together. I think it's a total of 6 books at this point. They're all terrific. I've read all of them. Anyway, Jana was sort of CIA's version of Q, the gadget guru of the James Bond movies, maybe combined with the disguise master Barney from the original Mission Impossible TV series. So now we circle back to the subject of magic here and intelligence, okay? Because Tony Mendez was an amateur magician. And at one point, he and Jana had come up with several clever ideas that the CIA engineering staff in Langley were unable to turn into working models. She will tell you more about that. But Tony had the idea when the CIA people failed, he said, let's go to Hollywood. Let's talk to illusion builders, right? Let's talk to special effects people about disguise. And, well, I'll describe this one. Donna might have a photo of this for you. So this is a description of a book called The Secret History of the CIA's Spy Techs by Wallace, Melton, and Schlesinger, 2008. And there the authors describe a specific example of using magician advisors and magic principles in clandestine tradecraft. Quote, if a magician could saw his beautiful assistant in half and then have her emerge intact from a coffin half a stage away, surely he could sneak someone past a surveillance team. A magician and his trick builders designed a dolly for rolling luggage that was loaded with varying sizes of suitcase, a steamer trunk, an ice chest. The facade of the baggage on the dolly appeared completely realistic. Each piece was designed to fit, however, around the legs, arms, torso, and head of a person, so that the agent could sit inside and be openly wheeled out of the hotel by a porter into a waiting van. The operation proceeded without incident, completely confounding the surveillance, close quote. And in another similar sort of operation, a person is smuggled out in a hand truck that appears to be loaded with cases of water cooler bottles, which are transparent, right? But in fact, they're lined with Mylar to conceal the person within. Great stuff. Just wonderful, wonderful stuff. I'll focus a bit here on Mendes's relationship with a guy named John Chambers, who Jana and Tony first met in Hollywood in '71. He was an American makeup artist and prosthetic makeup expert in both television and film. He received an honorary award from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in '68. He was famous for doing this original makeup on the original Planet of the Apes. He also was known for creating the pointed ears of Spock in the TV series. And he was, besides the Academy Awards, Chambers was awarded CIA's Intelligence Medal of Merit for his involvement in the Canadian caper, in which 6 American hostages were escaped, as described in Argo, where the role of Chambers was quite marvelously played by John Goodman. And John will talk more about that. I'll leave it at that. All right, let's move ahead now. The presence of magic and magicians in Spycraft has not been remanded to the pages of stale history books. We now move from the Cold War of the 60s and the 70s to the Hot War. Come back. To the Hot War in the Middle East in the 1990s. Some 40 years after Mulholland's work, General Norman Schwarzkopf, commander of Desert Storm in 1990, engineered swift victory, which relied on deception known as the left hook, in which the Americans lured Iraqi forces with a phony amphibious maneuver while sending his own forces looping around to the west. The result was that the Iraqi forces were rapidly encircled and essentially wiped out. All of that is now widely known. What is less recognized is that Schwarzkopf was an active, enthusiastic amateur magician. In discussing the success of the left hook battle plan with the aforementioned CIA Deputy Director John McLaughlin, he said to me, talking about Schwarzkopf, was he thinking like a magician? I think so. Of all the policy successes during that era, the Department of State and President George Bush are most clearly associated with Desert Storm, the successful effort to roll back the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. The success of Desert Storm was partly, if not substantially, due to the complex and coordinated military deception conceived under and by Schwarzkopf's command, came to be known as the left hook. And very briefly here, so the idea here is this. His intent was to wipe out Iraq's air force and then invade with ground forces from Iraq's southern border, proceeding westward through Iraq into Kuwait. But Iraq's massive concentration of troops, ground troops in that area, would have meant for an extended battle and for substantial casualties. So then they kind of sent back to think about it, and he and his team come up with left hook, which provides multiple evidence to the Iraqis that the U.S. was preparing an amphibious assault from the east on the coast there, from the east of Kuwait, and a ground assault from the south, across the Kuwait south and the Saudi Arabian border, on the southern Kuwait border. So eventually, with the study of Iraq records seized during the war, it was discovered that Iraq and Saddam were aware that this was possibly an intended deception as they became aware of U.S. troop movements that were moving to the west. But it appears that the deception served to sufficiently confuse the Iraqis into uncertainty and inaction. It's almost more interesting than having just outright fooled them, right? Because it ends up being effective, but kind of for the wrong reason. It enables the U.S. strategy to work. The left hook meant the U.S. and allied countries circled to the left and back, and the war was essentially over in about 100 hours. So harking back to elements of Dudley Clark and Jasper Maskelyne, decoy tanks, you can see here up in the graphic, decoy tanks were now used, but they were updated and enhanced with current technology, things like signal emulation and false heat signatures that match, right, from air detection and radar and so forth, make it convincing as tanks on the ground. So a combination of elements were used, these visual signal elements, also with PSYOPs, psychological operations, that in this case, in Left Hook, involved the dropping of 500,000 pamphlets along the southern and western axes of advance that were already being anticipated by the Iraqis, encouraging Iraqi units how to surrender. So that anticipation and confirmation means that the deception of the left hook were driven by and rendered effective thanks to what is known in military circles as the Magruder's principle, which holds that, quote, it is generally easier to induce the deception target to maintain a pre-existing belief than to deceive the deception target for the purpose of changing that belief. Right? And that's exactly what worked here. It's logical when you think about that, but it's actually what worked. Schwarzkopf's plan helped to convince Saddam, who was personally involved in the strategy, and Iraq's military of what they already believed, that the Western Alliance forces would come from the west and the south. Even presented with evidence to the contrary, they couldn't bring themselves to act contrary to their expectations of what they already believed, no matter, even if it was suspect. Fascinating. So when you think about the specifics of Schwarzkopf's left hook, consider again the words of Sun Tzu. All four of those principles were at work in the left hook deception. with a victory in 100 hours. Sun Tzu. Now, after retiring from the Army in '92, Schwarzkopf wrote a book, best-selling autobiography, Doesn't Take a Hero. He and his troops were welcomed home with a ticker tape parade in Broadway. President Bush eventually awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. But while you won't find this next and final detail anywhere in the public record of which I am aware, I know on the basis of first-hand accounts that President Bush and Norman Schwarzkopf had one more thing in common: Al's Magic Shop in Washington, D.C. That's Al Cohen. He's passed now. He's a dear friend of mine. He's a wonderful magician and owned this fabulous magic shop in Washington, D.C. I lived in D.C. in the late 80s. I hung out there all the time, and Al would tell me, I never encountered the president or the general, but Al would tell me, oh, hey, Bush was in the other day, and showed him a bunch of stuff. He always comes in to look at the latest stuff, and then they would always end up buying a few tricks to show their friends or their grandchildren. So there you go. And maybe John will tell you something else that the CIA was buying there. Now, I began by quoting from John McLaughlin. I'd like to talk just a bit more about him now, as we draw some concluding thoughts. McLaughlin spent more than 30 years as a CIA officer, quote, working on nearly every aspect of the business, and concluded his career as deputy director and acting director of CIA from 2000 to 2004. He now teaches at Johns Hopkins University in the School of Advanced International Studies. He's basically teaching future operatives as well as diplomats. Now, as it turns out, John McLaughlin and I know one another, and we are colleagues, not in the world of clandestine espionage, but rather in the super secretive world of magic. McLaughlin is a long-time, serious, accomplished amateur magician. We've crossed paths over the years at magic conventions, places where one or the other of us have been public speakers. In the course of my research, I reached out to him a couple of years ago, and I had the opportunity to have a very lengthy phone conversation with him. It was terrific. He talked about his days at the agency and how he would lecture staff. He'd perform classic magic like the cups and balls, coin magic, card magic, and without explaining how it works, he'd often tell them first what he was about to do, and then afterwards would pose the question, think how easy it is for people to fool you without telling you what they're going to do, right? So we also discussed how magicians think about what we call outs, which is namely knowing how to, in advance, what your options and avenues are going to be if events unfold in a way that differ from your original plan, trying to have the answers for what people are going to say or do in a negotiation and anticipating all of that. I asked him about Mulholland's work. He said most of Mulholland's specific methods were impractical and probably not put to use, especially for these things like slipping drugs into chemicals into somebody's drink, which McLaughlin claims there isn't much use for in the real world, although obviously the Russians would differ. Regarding Mulholland, he says, he speculates that Mulholland's contribution was a way of thinking about perception, how to judge what you're seeing, how to be skeptical, and on the tradecraft side, for operations officers, clandestine work overseas under surveillance, magic is helpful in thinking about how to operate in those environments, directing attention. He said, just having Mulholland around, I suspect he had an impact on operations training, that is, training recruits at the farm, the famous CIA training grounds. Ask about today's, he says, today this magic is still a presence in seeing magic principles as a tool. They are building a constituency toward that still within the agency. There's also some resistance to it, but it's definitely still there. His bottom line to intelligence people and to his students is simply this: just learn to think like a magician, you'll be a better intelligence officer. Now, this is a great picture of John right here. Here's a different picture of John advertising a local magic show in Washington, D.C. that he's performed at a few times. And he said to me that he continues to use magic today, 1, to sensitize officers to the dangers of deception, 2, to train clandestine officers to think like magicians, and 3, occasionally, he says, to entertain heads of state. Now, in the Moscow Rules, this excellent book written by Tony and John Mendez, I'm very fond of this book. The authors reference the late John Mulholland's CIA manuals there, and they write, quote, these 2 volumes demonstrated the CIA's respect for and interest in the using of tools of the professional magic industry to further the goals of gathering information. Magic and intelligence work would appear on the surface to be an unlikely combination, but as the partnership between the dark arts and the agency evolved, the craft of magic and the CIA's need for clandestine operations locked together like the last two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Thank you very much. Thank you.